Will we still be able to drive cars like this in 2030?
I bloody well hope so. This video is going to try and deconstruct quite a complex problem area. I break it down into a few questions with data and facts, not hearsay and opinion. Of course, as data, it's a classic valuer after all. So you'll see lots of numbers, you'll hear lots of numbers, but I'll pop them all on screen, and hopefully by the end of this you'll have a good idea of what the actual impact on the environment would be and how that compares to our day-to-day life, and really whether classic cars should objectively be on the roads post 2030. Right? Let's do it. The very first question to answer is, will we still have internal combustion engine cars on the road in 2030? And to answer that question, first you need to understand what the UK government, and we'll focus on the UK here, there's different rules in the EU and also the US and around the world, but just for the UK, what are they doing come 2030? So think about it this way, it's a staggered approach, right? From here until 2030, essentially anything goes. Cars that you have on the road now will still be there all the way through to 2030. Between 2030 and 2035, the government has said you will only be allowed to sell new cars that are either pure electric or hybrids. In other words, part internal combustion, part electric. So anything up to 2030, 2030 to 2035 is then pure electrics or hybrids. And then after 2035, it is only electric new cars that will be allowed to be sold in the UK. So what do you draw from that? The instant reaction is, oh God, internal combustion cars are off. However, that is almost certainly not the case, and I will tell you for why. And again, it starts in the data. The lovely people of the DVLA have done some number crunching, and the stats I'm going to quote in a second are all from them, so they are legitimate government sources. So what's the car landscape of the UK? Well, across the UK you've got 38.6 million vehicles, of which 31.7 million of them are cars. So just over 30 million cars in the UK. The next question to ask is, right, so what's the replacement rate? How many new cars are registered each year? That's not necessarily a direct replacement of an old car, it could be an additional one, but in the interest of simplicity, let's look at that to start with. If we look at the year previously, 2020, you can see that 1.6 million cars were newly registered onto the road. 2020 was obviously an interesting year. COVID, dealerships were shut for most of the first part of the year. That number's down about 30% on the previous year. In other words, on average, you're typically ending up around 2 million new cars registered on the road each year. The number flexes up and down, but if you take that as a baseline, you're in pretty good stead. Now, if you look at those new cars registered on the road last year, about 20% of them were what the DVLA label alternative fuels. So that's both your pure electrics and also your hybrids. So 20% of new cars last year were either hybrid or electric. However, the more interesting story is when you look at the previous year's trend, compare what kind of cars were sold in 2019 versus 2020. And here is where you see a bit of a trend of electric starting to move up an exponential curve. And actually there's a really good graph from the DVLA which I will pop up on screen now. So you can see a couple of things when you look at this graph. The first thing that stands out is petrol and diesel cars falling away in popularity. Last year, albeit COVID was in place, dealerships were closed, the number of petrol cars sold was 35% lower than the year previously, and the number of diesel cars was minus 50%. So basically, petrol and diesel cars are dropping away year on year, and that trend has started and it's only going to go one way. When you look at alternative fuels, you'll start to see a little tick up. That's an 87% rise on 2019. In other words, almost double the amount of alternative fuel cars sold in 2020 versus 2019. And when you extrapolate that trend out of electric cars rising 87% a year, diesel and petrol cars falling away at their respective year-on-year changes, you get to a point where in around 2023-2024, almost all cars sold on the road will be hybrid or electric. You'll see this when you look at manufacturers. So many manufacturers have come out already and said we will only make electric cars after 2025, after 2030. More and more would join that bandwagon. So don't expect to see plenty of new cars being sold as petrol and diesel beyond the midpoint of this decade. It just will not happen. And there's other things you can deduce from this trend. It will take a fair while for all of the cars that are currently on people's driveways, in their garages, to be replaced. If you took all of those 2 million cars and said, right, from right this point today, every single car sold forward each year, about 2 million, will be electric or will be hybrid. It will take 19 years for the current stock of cars that are on people's driveways to be churned away and then turned into electric or hybrid vehicles. Now, what that clearly doesn't consider is So those people who don't want to replace their car, those people that want their 60s MGA, their Jaguar Mark II, or even they prefer their Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera to a Rimac. Although given the stats the Rimac's just put out, that's probably not feasible. A debate for another day. So let's just recap that first question. Will internal combustion engines still be on our roads in 2030? The answer is absolutely yes. We know there's about 30 million cars in the UK, of which about 2 million are replaced each year with newly registered cars. Assuming every single car that's newly registered from here onwards is electric or a hybrid, we're heading into 2040 before all those cars are replaced. And we even know that lots of people, like myself, would probably want to keep their classic car downstairs in the garage for a nice summer's day and take it out for a hoon. So the question then becomes, for those folk, how long do they have petrol for? And that is part 2. Right, so if you were paying attention in the first part of this video, you might have noticed 2 things. Number 1, I only mentioned the sale of new vehicles. Used cars aren't affected by this ban as of yet. So you can still have used cars being sold beyond 2030 and beyond 2035. The second thing that you may have picked up on is I only mentioned cars. Interestingly, the government's ban doesn't apply to motorcycles, it doesn't apply to HGVs, it doesn't apply to farm machinery, to aviation, to ships. It's just cars that they're focusing on at this point in time. And then you go, right, well, if motorcycles can continue to get fuel, then in theory I'll be able to keep getting fuel for my car as well. On top of that, then you ask yourself the question, right, so hybrids can be sold up until 2035. You would assume a lifespan of a hybrid car is 10 to 15 years. That takes you through to 2045, 2050, when there will still be petrol available on our forecourts. Now, the one caveat here is the government could turn around and drive a ban on those vehicles being on our UK roads. I think it's highly unlikely. The number of jobs it supports around the UK and the tax revenue it generates for the Treasury is too large that they would impose that ban. In other words, what you'll find is that up to 2045 and probably well beyond that period, petrol will still be available on our forecourts. It is not disappearing, it is not going away. Unless the government has a radical rethink on its policy, you will still be able to get your hands on petrol and diesel. Do not worry. What we do know though is at some point petrol and diesel will disappear from our roads. We don't know exactly the date, but what the question it does ask, and this is question number 3, what happens when petrol and diesel is no longer obtainable on UK roads, whenever that may be? So question number 3, how do I fuel my vehicle in the very long term, but equally how do I fuel things like aviation industry, how do I fuel ships, how do you get those to a carbon neutral space? So Airbus ran the numbers on this and they tried to work out how many batteries would we need to fly an A320, one of their smaller airliners, on a normal flight. And they came up with this finding. Even if they had batteries 30 times denser than they currently are, an A320 would only be able to fly a fifth as far as they can fly now, carrying half its payload. In other words, even if battery technology was 30 times more advanced, you would still be unable to go the normal distance with a normal payload in the batteries. Not even half the distance, a fifth of the distance with half the payload, which is absolutely insane. And then you go, okay, well, if not batteries in the short or the medium term, what is it going to be? And this is where the good news comes in. Carbon neutral fuels. There's generally 2 types, synthetic fuels or e-fuels. And the key thing here is these fuels have the same energy density and volume as you would normally have with petrol or diesel. And they can drop right into your internal combustion engine and operate your car pretty much as it is right now. So no need for a radical overhaul, but you're dropping these carbon neutral fuels in. The really good news is they release far fewer fossil fuels out of your exhaust. They create fewer particulates and fewer nitrogen oxides, which essentially means less damage on the environment. However, they are currently rather expensive. Not unwieldy expensive. Companies like Bosch, companies like Porsche and other big organisations are investing massively into this space, and we will see those prices fall, and at which point you could see these carbon neutral fuels firing HGVs, firing farm machinery, aviation, ships, and potentially also our classic cars. However, the argument the government is making on this is wrong, and I will explain exactly why on question 4 when we look at the level of emissions a new car produces throughout its life. this is the good bit. Well, the rest of it was good as well, but this is the particularly good bit. The general consensus in the population is this: that classic cars are bad for the environment, they spit out far more particulates that accelerates climate change, and they are bad news, whereas electric cars are the way forward. Now, let's try and work that through based on data and facts. We're going to look at an electric car. Polestar have done some great research in this space, and we'll look at the emissions produced in manufacturing and during its life. We're going to compare that to a classic car, and then also a standard Volvo XC40, your everyday car. Nothing too offensive, nothing too special. No offense to any XC40 owners, actually quite like the car. Right, so during the manufacturing process, Polestar have crunched the numbers and looked on how many tons of CO2 are produced during the manufacturing process. For a Volvo XC40, that number is 14 tons. For a Polestar 2, the materials and battery come to 24 tons. So in other words, the electric car is impacting the environment 75% more than your standard Volvo XC40 would during that manufacturing process, which is an insane stat. That's primarily driven by the battery. There's loads of variables that go into that. Where's the battery sourced from? How is it sourced? And also where the manufacturing plant is around the world. And I'm sure these numbers will fall. At the moment, that is quite high and also quite shocking. So let's turn our focus to what happens when it's during its life. So after the manufacturing process, what are the emissions that the cars produce? Now, the big variable here is, where do you get your power from? Is it a fossil fuel, or is it a more environmentally friendly source? Obviously, for a Volvo XC40, it's going to be a fossil fuel. And you look at that, they average about 41 tons of CO2 is produced during its lifetime. For the Polestar, the numbers are much better. If you look at it from a global power mix, a European power mix, or if you're on a wind or solar power, you'll get to different figures. European power mix is probably a fair representation of where the UK is currently at, albeit we're a little bit ahead of Europe on our green transition. But if you look at the European power mix, it's about 15 tons of CO2. So 26 tons less over its lifetime. So playing that back, if you look at new cars, a Polestar over its life will generate about 39 tons of CO2. A Volvo XC40 on a European power mix as we currently are is about 52 tons of CO2. So worse by a margin of about 30%. Which, given all the kerfuffle, isn't actually that much of a sizable jump given the environmental cost of replacing all of the current cars that are in the system. Now, the key obviously is to go, how do you develop the batteries in a more sustainable way? And also, given that the majority of emissions are in the manufacturing process for an electric car, how do you extend the life cycle, and how do you make them work and operate over that whole period? We've all been there with our iPhones or our Androids. You have the phone a few years and all of a sudden your battery that used to last you a day and a half now lasts you about 7 hours or 6 hours or 5 hours. On this phone, probably about 3 hours. How do you stop that regular cycle of cars and therefore the emissions being generated in the manufacturing process? And this is where classic cars start to become more appealing. Question number 5 to answer, and our final one: what is the environmental damage of a classic car? And we're going to break this down again during the in-manufacture process and during its life. Start with the easy one. In manufacture is nil point. Zero. It's already been made, it's already been produced, the emissions are there, they're in the atmosphere, we can't do anything about it, but they are a sunk cost, as it were. Alrighty, moving from the in-manufacture process to the in-life emissions of a car. Let's have a little look. Now, we know that classic cars do around 1,200 miles on average each year. A normal car would do about 7,200 miles, but for a classic it's 1,200. If you take the 1,200 miles and assume 20 mpg, I'm fueling my car with petrol, the total emissions your classic car would generate in an average year is 651 kilograms of CO2. That's kilograms, not tons, to be super clear. Putting that in context, if you were to take a mobile phone, use it daily, charge it every evening, the emissions you'd put out into the environment would be 1,250 kilograms of CO2. If you then look at a laptop, that number rises with daily usage, daily charging, to 1,400 kilograms of CO2. In other words, using your classic car as you would normally is less than half as bad for the environment as using a laptop every day. This is hard facts and data. And when you put it into context even more, you go, right, well, we know an electric car produces 24 tons of CO2 during its manufacturing process. Extrapolating that out, I could use my classic car for 36 years and generate the same amount of emissions as an electric car would before that electric car's even done a mile. which is just an insane figure. And that's why I believe the government is making a poor decision on this and really has not been informed by the data, the facts, the feasibility of this rollout as well. We focus on the emissions so far. One quick point just to mention is the people cost, the tax cost as well. So there was some great research done by the Historic Vehicle and Classic Vehicle Association, and they said the classic car industry is worth £18.3 billion to the UK economy each year. Of that, £2.9 billion is in tax revenue going into Rishi Sunak's pockets. And there's people far beyond this as well. The industry itself employs 113,000 people around the UK, 665 apprenticeships, and we know how hard the young have been hit during the pandemic and the loss of jobs there. So, conclusion, where does this leave us? Our roads will not be silent in 2030, so please don't worry about being run over by an electric car as you cross the street and not hear it coming. Secondarily, petrol will be on our roads well beyond 2030. Very hard to place a date on it. I'd say 2045, 2050 is a very plausible date to still see fuel on the roads. I wouldn't be surprised if it went even longer than that. And carbon neutral fuels, I think, are the main glimmer of hope for the classic car enthusiast. If they can get to a good price point, if they can get to a position where they are freely available, dropping those into your engines means the emissions out of your exhaust pipe are greatly reduced, and therefore your environmental damage is greatly reduced, which makes them a whole more palatable option to drive down the street with. However, the key point here is the government is making a false argument. Classic cars in particular, it's a different story for your standard Ford Focus, for your Ford Fiesta and other brands. I'm not just picking on Ford here, but driving a classic car on average each year generates less than half the emissions that using your laptop every day would. And it would take 36 years for a classic car to generate the same amount of emissions that an electric car does just in the manufacturing process. Now, if those two stats don't stick in your mind, I'm not sure what will. So that is our viewpoint on the classic car market and where it is going post 2030. I'd love to hear your own opinions. Pop a comment down below and I'll respond back. Otherwise, if you've got a spare 5 minutes, pop onto theclassicvaluer.com and you can see the price and price trend of any classic car there. Hopefully you enjoy it. I've enjoyed researching and making this video, and we'll be back shortly with another.